You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host Michael on a Friday, joined by Mike Lewis. We're talking about the question involving the Latin Mass, a recent rescript touching on the Latin Mass that came from Cardinal Roche. I guess that's the correct pronunciation, right? I've heard various pronunciations, actually.
I saw someone actually last time say it rhymes with coach. I don't know if that was...
I don't know if that's right.
There's an insect that sounds like that too, so I don't know if that was what the intention was. I've heard it. Said Roche, but
I've always thought it was Roche, but I saw that too, and so I'm trying to double check here. But we're gonna go with Roche rather than any other variant until he corrects us. So, but anyways, welcome back to the show. Glad to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, in this discussion kind of precipitated because I saw. Some news came out. I think it was NCR Online that had an article that was talking about this issue, and it referenced where Peter is. And I was like, oh, okay. Let me call Mike up and see what's going on with this. And you kind of walked me through it, and I thought, it would be helpful for you to come on the show and maybe talk about it. So can you maybe set us up here and tell us what exactly is going on? What is a rescript? Why was there one? Who is Cardinal Roche? What exactly is going on with the Latin Mass? Maybe walk us through that.
There's nothing more fun to talk about on a Friday night than Latin Mass restrictions.
Rescripts.
Rescripts. Curial intrigue. First of all, I want to say, Michael, I think you did a really good job of laying out the issue and actually sort of the official line of what happened. If we go back to Traditionis, Custodes, which came out in July of 2021, obviously very controversial.
Yeah.
Both you and I have discussed about, this was done to address the issue of radical traditionalism.
Mm-hmm.
And there are different ways that it could have been approached by the Pope. And as it is, they put forward this. Now, Cardinal Arthur Roche, who was then, now I'm saying Roche, who he had been the secretary of the Congregation of Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, which is now the dicastery, under Cardinal Sarah, or Cardinal Sarah, people pronounce it both ways. And he was basically, after Cardinal Sarah stepped down, his retirement was accepted. There were a couple of months where Pope Francis did some investigations and or I guess a visitation. He sent, a cardinal to take a look at the dicastery and see what their needs were going forward. And obviously it kind of sounds like he had done that polling of the bishops. He had, it looked like something like Traditionis Custodes was on its way.
Mm-hmm.
And he elevated Archbishop Roche to prefect, and then last year, a year later, wound up naming him cardinal, and most prefects of major congregations are cardinals, so that was expected. One thing that's interesting about Cardinal Roche is that he's an English speaker. He's from England, which means I think he's probably a lot more in tune with American media, and obviously you have rad trads in England too,
sure.
Michael Davies and Joseph Shaw. So it's not like there's he's probably a little bit more tuned in. He was also the president of ISIL when, this is a little bit before you became Catholic, Michael, but it was when, we changed translations in English.
Yeah.
Where we used to say, and also with you, and now we say, and with your spirit. So he was the head of basically the committee that helped to translate the missal into the more accurate English language translation. So, long story short, that's the basic background of him. That's the basic background of Traditionis Custodes. Obviously, when it came out, hugely controversial.
Right.
One of the things that was happening right off the bat was, you look at traditionalist blogs. How can we avoid, implementing this? What are the loopholes we can exploit? What are the, how are we how can we make none of this happen? And what happened was, one of the things that traditionalist blogs said right off the bat was it doesn't specifically address whether a bishop can dispense from
Okay.
from these provisions.
Mm-hmm.
And it did say in Article 7 that the Pope had delegated his papal authority to the Dicastery for Divine Worship, or the congregation at the time. And so what was happening was you were having a situation in the United States where certain bishops were issuing dispensations that were basically saying that Traditionis Custodes is a dead letter.
Mm-hmm.
And you had Archbishop Roche, who's like responding to these things and saying, no, you have to ask for permission to do this first. And he issued a document, Responsa ad Dubia, in December 2021, which it said at the very bottom of it, it said, this was presented to the Pope in a private audience. He assented to it, and these provisions were reviewed by him. It didn't say explicitly like these are 100% papal bull. I'm going to stamp it. It wasn't ex cathedra. But the interesting thing was, and something I pointed out at the time, was the language that was used, the language of assent that's at the bottom of that responsa ad dubia is exactly the same language that was used on the CDF statement for same-sex blessings. Which is just, they're like the only, at the time, there may have been more since then, but at the time, those were the only two documents that had that type of papal approval on the whole history of the Vatican website. So it's kind of like, if you're going to accept one, you kind of got to accept, that kind of thing.
Sure.
I don't know, like that's the Easter egg I picked up. I don't know. I don't have any inside information. I just noted that it was interesting. No one else seems to care, but maybe someone in your audience will. So anyway, even after that came out, though, some people in the media were saying that, this responsa ad dubia, even though it answered the question saying that Rome has to approve certain things, they were saying that this doesn't have any authority. It's just, it's just sort of maybe a general sense that people can get. And it's sort of like, to me, common sense says if the Pope is going to like assent to this document and they're going to do it in a private audience, like, how does it mean nothing?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not were they just wasting their time going over this, really long document?
Right.
So then, I guess what's been happening more recently is that bishops have been asking Cardinal Roche if they need permission, if they need to ask permission from his dicastery in order to either, certify priests who were ordained after 2021, whether or not they can continue to celebrate the 1962 Missal in parish churches. Do they need permission to do that? And he was responding yes. And he was explaining that Article 7 that reserves authority over this covers that. Like, basically, my dicastery is in charge of implementing liturgical change. Now, I understand, obviously, people have different opinions about Traditionis Custodes, but the question is, what does the law say?
Sure.
And to me, from a common sense standpoint, but then I also talked to other people in the church, reached out to canon lawyers, tried to get a general sense of this. It seemed to be the common sense reading. But the Pillar in February wrote an article basically saying that Cardinal Roche had done some kind of power grab, that he was acting against the church, that he was just asserting authority that he didn't have. And I mean, to me, it seemed like a little bit of a stretch, especially since people are talking about this apostolic constitution that's coming out in April. Like, that'll probably wipe out any question about anything, assuming and I have no inside information. I don't know if that's true or not. But I did think, well, maybe I'll send an email to the dicastery and see if I get a response. And I was a little bit shocked. Well, first, I actually got a response from Cardinal Roche saying, I'll get back to you in 24 hours. And then I wrote to him 28 hours later, hey, have you heard from, and this is probably more inside baseball than you'll usually get. 28 hours later, and he said, I didn't get a chance today. I'll get back to you tomorrow. And then the next day, it was, dear Mike, here's a quote. And I don't know if you have the quote on hand. I should probably pull that up.
Oh yeah, if you can, that'd be helpful actually.
So
Yeah, sorry.
so let me pull up that
And
particular.
while you're doing that, by the way, I hear something in the background that occasionally happens. It sounds like a ball is dropping. Bup, 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 like it's
It could be my is my microphone
yeah, I
causing
heard it
that
just
something?
now
Okay, so
again.
I'm playing with my mic.
It sounds like there's something that's bouncing off something. Da, da, da.
No,
It's
that's my
weird.
camera bouncing around.
I don't know.
How
It
often is it
doesn't.
happening?
It's every 5 to 10 seconds, and it's
I'm
like
sorry.
three bounces on something. I don't know.
I got like 8 things. Like the thing is, like I have not like podcasted in forever, so it was sort of like Mike, can you come on the show? And I plugged in like 8 things, so I don't know if
That's okay.
And so
That's
it's
okay.
like there's a balancing act going on, like in front of
Yeah,
everything. Like
yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen like the making of Star Wars before, but like they have these shots, right?
Yeah.
And then everything that is like 1 inch outside the shot is like a disaster.
And
And that's what's going on in my office right now. Is it
That's
still
funny.
bumping?
I don't hear anything at the moment.
It's because well, I mean, I did move my microphone, so I'm just. And it was like I
Yeah.
have a new set of headphones too, but it was like I'm
Yeah.
not going to try to like get the Bluetooth working before.
Maybe that fixed it because I don't hear it anymore.
Okay.
But
It might have been bumping up against a button or something.
yeah,
Like
maybe
that.
so. Maybe
All
so.
right, let
But
me pull up my
yeah, that'd be helpful. I'm pretty amazed that he responded
yeah.
to your request. That's awesome.
Well, it's just sort of like I mean, one of the interesting things is it's like they, the website that I was criticizing doesn't even, acknowledge my existence. So it's kind of funny. But okay. So here's the quote. He wrote, "It is an absurdity to think that the prefect of a dicastery would do anything other than exercise the wishes of the Holy Father as clearly outlined in their mandate and the general norms of Predicate Evangelium." That's the new Curia document.
Mm-hmm.
The article in the pillar is not really an attack on me, but on the Pope's authority, which for Catholics is an astonishing act full of hubris. So,
But yeah, now doesn't the rescript, however, prove their point that it wasn't done according to the law?
well, that's their. It's interesting because I kind of thought right away that was going to be their
Mm-hmm.
response. Like basically what they're saying is, look, there's a rescript, which means he didn't have this right in the first place.
Yeah.
But so let's go to what a rescript is.
Okay.
And this happens pretty frequently. Basically, it's a document approved by the Pope that gives some kind of exemption or a favor or a clarification.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of cases, it happens in like a private audience. The Buenos Aires directives, the Buenos Aires guidelines from Amoris Laetitia, they were designated as magisterial by a rescript that was written by Cardinal Parolin, I believe, but Pope Francis ordered it to be magisterial. So in this case, Cardinal Roche took with him this document, and it basically says that under this rescript confirms that Article 7 grants this right to the prefect, and then it goes into more detail about what the that this was a right that was already established, but here we're going to make it explicit and clear. Now, the fact that Cardinal Roche himself wrote this rescript, got the Pope to sign off on it, the way it's worded, you would think he's not going to throw himself under the bus. He's getting himself a clarification. But unfortunately, I mean, at least, from my perspective, I think it's just another layer of spin. So what you're reading is people are saying it's new law. He's establishing something that wasn't there before. I think what it is really it's a clarification, and it's Cardinal Roche being in tune with what people are saying and with what people are doing, and just saying, I want to put a stop to it.
And now that this clarification has happened, what are they going to do at this point?
So basically, J.D. Flynn, the editor of the Pillar, said he had a 2,600 word article about it ready to go on Tuesday that he basically had to junk because this is unquestionably authoritative. And it seems to me that a lot of people that are accepting of Vatican II, maybe a little bit wary of Pope Francis, but not like in the rad trad mold, they're accepting the legal ramifications of this.
Mhm.
Others, like I saw, a prominent traditionalist, who was 100% behind the pillar at first when JD wrote this and said, well, now this is the rule. He's sort of like, this is positivism and hyperpapalism and unfair authority. It was opportunistic, but I think it's sort of a combination of two things. And then others, it's like, well, the cardinal gave me a quote, so I think he thinks I'm right. So and that's really what all I was trying to seek to do was look at it from a realistic perspective, because looking for legal loopholes and trying to play games in the long run, it's not going to work out. What Traditionis Custodes is trying to do, and what's the more likely scenario? I mean, that's kind of the way I approached it. I don't expect that Cardinal Roche is going to go back down that rabbit hole. I think he kind of said his piece. But the fact that enough people now, including bishops, acknowledge that, okay, this is the law, it's been clarified, now we have to do it. I think that's sort of the end of this chapter.
It's going to be a tough pill to swallow for some people.
Yeah, no, and I understand. And it's funny because I think it makes, I think to a certain extent, bishops using, Canon 87, like, okay, well, we need to get this oratory set up, or we want to get this hall converted into a chapel or something like that. Now they have to go. In the past, earlier, they could have invoked 87 and let things work out naturally. But because such a point was being made of it, now it's like anytime you want to use Canon 87 for this, you got to go to the Vatican. So it's one of those things where I think it backfired legally to a certain extent. And I mean, and it is, and I guess I'm talking, I'm sort of talking about it from this like journalistic standpoint where it's like, I got it right. I got the story. I got the quote. The Pope signed a rescript that proved me right. And and when I talk about this, I do realize, like, I'm, and I apologize to those of you who are devoted to the traditional Latin Mass and who are hurt by this, because that's not my intent. It's just, it's a matter of, I guess, as we were talking about earlier, just sort of journalistic bias and understanding where people are coming from when they're, I kind of read a bias into what the Pillar article was saying, because I didn't think it was grounded in reality, the reality of the situation. And, I think that's kind of what wound up happening. But
And I want to talk about those biases here in a moment, but first let's talk about your position on Traditionis Custodes. I mean, mine I've spoken about it many times, my position on it, but I want to hear yours. What do you think about it? Do you agree with it? Disagree with it? What's your take?
Well, just the little anecdote that I wanted to give is, like you, except, I've probably been in this, been attacked by radical traditionalists for very, very long time. Where Peter is started in 2018, even before that on Twitter and so forth. But, so I was very acclimated to these arguments. I was getting kind of frustrated with the traditionalist movement. And then I think it was what was the date that it came out? July 16th, 2021.
Oh, yeah. Let's see.
The night of July 15th, I was on YouTube, and I happened to be watching the speech that Peter Kwasniewski was giving.
July 16th.
So he gave a speech, I think July 3rd or 4th, but I stumbled across it on July 15th, and it was about the flaws in Summorum Pontificum. And he was saying basically, like, Summorum Pontificum was a step forward, but it needs to, take the part where it's two forms of one rite. And he's like, it's not the same rite. This is a new rite. It's the Pauline rite. It's not the Roman rite. And he's sort of going on and on about taking basically everything in Summorum Pontificum that affirms Vatican II or the liturgical reform and saying that it needs to go. And by the end of this, like 40-minute talk, my jaw is open and I'm like, Pope Benedict made a terrible mistake. And then I wake up the next morning and and Traditionis Custodes comes out. And so, and I think a lot of maybe my reaction at the time was a little bit too emotive and a little bit too, wasn't concerned enough maybe for the people who really were of goodwill and who were affected by this. I think so. This is kind of my proposal, and I don't know how people would take it or not. But one of the things that I've been told along the way is that a lot of people who love the Latin Mass go there because for one thing, it's the community. They love their communities. They love the people there. They love the priests. They love the values. They love the reverence at the Mass. A lot of young people with young families, find the type of community there that they didn't want otherwise. And one of the things that my alternative suggestion would have been, and I don't know what your listeners think about this, but I'm throwing this out there as a hypothetical, would be, well, let's keep the communities intact. Let's keep the style of worship. Let's keep the music, but let's maybe a document that would have affirmed the community's right to worship ad orientem and to keep the communion rail and to worship in Latin, like maintain that, and so then the people who oppose, yes, I understand that there are other elements that people prefer from the older forms of liturgy, but as a concession and to keep the unity of the church and the unity of these communities, I think that something like that might have been a better.
So to clarify, your position effectively is that, okay, if he's going to take this direction of restricting the Missal of 62 in parishes, then at least say, okay, instead in those parishes, what you can have is Latin, Gregorian chant, and things like that. Now, I remember in the document he did mention that, in the Novus Ordo, you do have the option to have Latin and things like that. But I think what you're saying is not just say, hey, we're reiterating the point that you have these options, but to actually mandate that in those parishes, it would be ad orientem. You wouldn't be prevented from doing it ad orientem. You wouldn't be prevented from it being Latin. You would absolutely mandate it, have it in Latin, have Gregorian chant, have all that. So it'd be the Novus Ordo text, but it would be all of those things. Is that effectively what you're saying your position is?
I mean, I think what it would come down to is, I know that one of the reasons why Summorum Pontificum came out was because the 1988 indult, in a lot of cases, the bishops were not generous in applying it. And so one of the things that Summorum Pontificum did is it took that out of the hands of the bishop, like the right, but it's like maybe taking, at least for those communities, like I could understand that if some pastor decided to randomly decide, in some suburban Chicago parish that had guitar mass and said, okay, from now on we're doing Latin Mass and ad orientem. I could see, but in those but to keep those communities intact and to also, it's another way of kind of fulfilling Vatican II. People always talk about those two lines in Summorum Pontificum about Gregorian chant and the Latin language being preserved and having a pride of place. And it's like, why not, utilize these parishes to keep that alive? So that's, I mean, that's sort of my, I mean, I'm sort of liturgically, I am basically conservative in terms of reverence and genuflecting and kneeling and all those in the Eastern churches standing.
Sure.
I mean, I receive on the tongue, except, during COVID, it was like a sacrifice for me to receive in the hand because but I did it out of respect to what my bishop requested.
Sure, of course. But you normally receive in the Roman Rite.
Absolutely. So my tendencies tend to be liturgically conservative, maybe not liturgically way out there, but I do understand that a lot of people do, like the charismatic renewal is a big thing there are people who come to the church and enjoy like praise and worship music. Like as long as the lyrics to the songs are oriented towards worship and it doesn't get out of hand, I think, it's like to each his own, as long as reverent liturgy is available, I guess would be my
just not your cup of tea.
Just not my cup of tea. Yeah, exactly. So
yeah,
and I think that preserving certain ancient parts of the Roman Rite is a good thing. So I mean that's my alternate proposal,
sure.
rather than sort of making it like I would have, but this would have been the big thing. It would have been like, you have until the end of the year or starting next liturgical year, this is what we're switching to. And then obviously that would have meant that the 1962 missal would have been, going off into the sunset, which I think the most radical of the radical traditionalists would be forced to make a choice. But I think it's an important choice that needs to be made that they're not making right now. They're trying to delay that as much as possible.
Well, and some are saying, well, Pope Francis shouldn't force them to make that choice if they end up leaving the church over the issue. And what I'm thinking is, but you know what? I totally understand that, but at the same time, wouldn't that just be bringing out into the open the schism that was already in the heart? It seems like there's already a problem in the heart if this is what pushes you over the edge, a liturgical preference, because that's what this is. This is a liturgical preference. If a liturgical preference is what pushes you over the edge to leave the church, not a preservation of sacred tradition, as they will guise this in language of I'm preserving no, you're not. No, you're not. This is a liturgical preference that you're defending under the guise of I'm defending sacred tradition or what have you.
Well, it's more like an ideology you're defending under the guise of a liturgical
an ideology and a preference. But to leave the church over that, it seems like that there was already a schism in the heart, and this just brought it out. So I'm not exactly sure that this would be on Pope Francis if he forces their hand. However, at the same time, I want to say, but isn't it possible to deal with that group of people without punishing people who prefer the Missal of 62 but don't harbor schism in their heart? Why should they have to suffer because of other people who do harbor schism and are fomenting schism? It seems like
that's why I know my compromise would cause some pain.
Yeah,
obviously, but I think when it comes down to it, it's like this, as long as the style of the liturgy is maintained and the core of the liturgy remains the same, which is what we're taught, in the reforms, it's still in the essence, it is still the liturgy. I mean, it's tough. I mean, I'll admit it would be very tough, but I think it's I don't know. To me, it seems like that would be a good compromise.
Yeah.
And it would, and my main concern, because something that people keep bringing up, is breaking up these communities, and I do feel bad about that. But they'll say they're being driven to somewhere else. Well, if they have an option to stay, but under these conditions, then maybe
they have an option to stay with the Novus Ordo. Period. Yeah. Period. I mean, end of story. I mean, now I'm not saying that Pope Francis should limit them to that. Yeah. Because personally, I don't think he should. But I'm just saying, if he were to, they still have an option to stay in the Roman Rite as it's currently expressed in the Novus Ordo. They have that option. Now, nobody's saying that you have to go to a place filled with liturgical abuses. That's a different subject. But the vast majority of Novus Ordos aren't just filled with outrageous liturgical abuses. And so that's not the case for the vast majority of people.
Yeah. But I do know a couple of local parishes, because Washington, D.C., we had 6 or 7, I think, 1962 masses, locations. And now it's down to 3 that are non-parishes. And being in D.C., we've got these chapels and oratories everywhere. But a couple of the parishes, one of them had a 3 p.m. TLM, and another one had a 9 a.m. And they're gone now. People just stopped going. They chased down the extraordinary form.
That noise. Did you hear that, by the way?
No, I heard your dog.
No, I hear him too. Am
I still clicking?
I heard it sounds like, like
Is
whenever
it still going? Has it been going this whole time?
yeah, it's like whenever a golf ball goes in the hole, that's exactly what it sounds like. Like putt-putt or
It's
something.
gotta be. It's gotta be this. I don't know. I wish I
I
had
don't know,
better
but
headphones for this.
between the putt-putt and the dog, we're getting some some background here. But okay, so yeah, gosh, and I'm trying to think where I was going with this now. Now that we've had the putt putt and dog conversation,
Does
remind
your
me.
dog play
Get,
putt putt? Is that?
no, maybe
I
he
mean, I
is
think we're
playing
just.
putt
I don't
putt.
know if anyone in the. I'd be curious if anyone in the comments has really
I
been
remember
talking
I
about
remember
that.
what I was gonna
Yeah.
say. The Ecclesia Dei groups, for instance, your FSSP, they aren't impacted by Traditionis Custodes, and Pope Francis put that in writing.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we know that the FSSP. I don't know that he wrote about any of the other ones. It was sort of. It was very. It seemed like a very spontaneous thing.
mhm,
He had an audience with two of their leaders, and
mhm,
they came out of the audience with this signed thing saying that
sure.
it wasn't going to affect them yet. Now people are saying that the apostolic constitution might affect them.
The apostolic, in other words, the rumors of a document that's
Mhm.
coming out. Can you comment on that? Do you think that this is a legitimate document? It's actually coming out. There's going to be a constitution. Talk to us about that.
Okay, so I have absolutely no inside information on it.
Okay.
I'll give you that. But to summarize what people are saying, take it with a grain of salt.
Okay.
Um, one of the things that it supposedly was planning to do was to shore up the things in Traditionis Custodes that people were using as loopholes
Okay.
that would affect like your parish churches and your dioceses and all that kind of thing. The other aspect, though, was the former Ecclesia Dei groups, which are these um, Fraternal Society of Saint Peter, the FSSP, the Institute of Christ the King, Sovereign
Hmm.
Priest, ICKSP. These
Hmm.
groups that are devoted to the Latin Mass. Um, there are some rumors, and people can kind of look at um, maybe what happened in Chicago with ICKSP, where basically on the first Sunday of the month, they would have to do like a Latin Novus Ordo, and the Triduum would only be in the new. And this is all rumors and all speculation, but the Triduum would have to be in the Novus Ordo, and
Hmm.
other people have said that like confirmation and possibly ordinations would be done according to the Reformed books,
Hmm.
which in terms of validity shouldn't be problematic. I think, like I said, I would advise that if you're working with these groups, that the style of worship should match the more traditional style.
Hmm.
Don't put a table in front of their altar when you do a confirmation at their parish.
Sure.
Continue with the ad orientem. But
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that, and this is something where I've gone back to Paul VI a lot. Like I don't know how much you've read into like kind of the history of it, but Paul VI, I don't think foresaw the older forms opening up. He saw it as a sun setting,
Hmm.
and I think with John Paul II, it was a little bit of, well, if the only thing these people are disagreeing about is the liturgy, then let's
Yeah.
let them have it. Whereas with Benedict, I think he was the real outlier in the fact that he had serious criticisms of the liturgical reform
Hmm.
and the way it was carried out, and he wanted an opening up again.
Hmm.
Um, Francis, I see as sort of going back to uh, early JP2, late Paul VI, in
Yeah.
terms of some accommodations, but this is the way that we're going liturgically.
Yeah.
So I think that that's kind of the route that things are headed. Um, I think it's a time for Catholics to do some reflection and prayer and discernment and reading um,
Hmm.
about what's going on, and because I think hardness of heart can develop, and I think obviously it's upsetting to a lot of people. Um, but yeah, I mean, speaking realistically, and it's kind of a shoot the messenger kind of thing, but it's like I don't think that the next pope is going to, uh, you know, hit the reverse button.
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen.
but I think, one of the things, and it's interesting because like people don't really mention this a lot about Pope Francis, but and they always say Jesuits don't care about liturgy. Like that's I don't know. You can ask your friend, the Jesuit that you have,
Father Brown.
Yeah, ask Father Brown if Jesuits care about liturgy or if he's watching. But it's like that's a joke that's made because for him it's like say the black, do the red, strictly business. Like, he might say a mass, he might travel to a foreign country where they've got flamenco dancers, but it's like that's not him. Like with him, it's when he would do his daily mass, at Casa Santa Marta, or when he does a mass at St. Peter's, it's very traditional. It's very just like this is what the church does. And I don't think that many of the cardinals are terribly avant-garde when it comes to, I mean, even Cardinal Roche. Cardinal Roche is like a very conservative Novus Ordo. It's sort of like very conservative Vatican II. Now, I think the other day you were talking about Vatican II and like the official line of the Vatican is that the current Roman Rite is the result of Vatican II. Now there's the debate, like what happened between Sacrosanctum Concilium and
see that's where it gets a little complex because
it does get complex, but I'm saying that's the party line. Like that's it's like
I'd offer a little pushback on the party line.
I understand. But actually, I think if we got to a point where we accepted one liturgy, then we could start talking about some of these things. We could start talking about, talk about the liturgy as if it's one, and how can we improve it? What improvements could be made? What sorts of things have we lost that could be restored? And instead, it's this old versus new, which I think is in some ways it's a distraction. Like at best, it's a distraction, and at worst, it's a vehicle for these, ideologies.
Benedict XVI spoke of two forms of the one Roman Rite mutually enriching each other. And, I think a lot of people that defended and praised and lauded Summorum Pontificum, I think at the end of the day, they don't actually believe Benedict on that. They don't believe that. They don't believe it's one form of the Roman Rite, because if they did, they would say, okay, well, I can make do with the Novus Ordo and reform it and have a reform of the reform and beef up the Novus Ordo. No, some in principle will just say, absolutely not, no Novus Ordo, even the most reverent Novus Ordo, absolutely not, it's off the table. Well, you didn't really believe what Benedict said to begin with then.
Well, and that's what when I was watching the Peter Kwasniewski talk, I'm like, he's just rejecting everything that's being said here. And I think most people can say that it is a reform of the Roman Rite. It may have been a reform that went overboard. It may have been a reform that wasn't carried out well. But we started with the Roman Rite, and then we
still have the Roman Rite. It's just that I do think that there needs to be further reform of the reform.
Oh yeah. And I mean, I think that's what we talk about with. I mean, it's funny because people talk about organic development, and it seems that there's a very strict form of traditionalists hold to a very strict form of organic development, and then they say that after 1570 it crystallized. Well, I don't think that's really what happened. I think in 1570 the Pope said you have to do the Roman Rite this way, and that's why it didn't really change. And then in Sacrosanctum Concilium, organic development is mentioned only once. And that's in the context of we can't make a reform unless it's actually connected to something in the tradition, which is, because it's like you think about organic, like if every change has to be approved by the Pope and has been since 1570, there's nothing that can't really be organic in the sense of it naturally happening. If that makes sense. That's kind of a side tangent, but it's Friday night, so we're talking about liturgical reform.
Absolutely. And I do want to get to some chat questions here, so hold off on those, but in about 2 or 3 minutes, go ahead and start sending them. Then make sure to send them to @Reason and Theology. Let me ask you about one more thing. You were talking about sources and kind of considering sources, and this is something that I've just become more and more attuned to, in the last few years, because I started noticing that people were taking me out of context, twisting my words, and people would just take other people's words for it and then repeat those falsehoods back to me and say, Michael, you believe this, or you're just a that. And I'm thinking, you've never even bothered to actually listen to me. You just listened to this other guy who misspoke or lied about me. And so seeing that and experiencing that, that started to make me critically question a lot of the sources that I had been a little bit more trustful, in the past. But at that point, I started saying, let me really start to question that trust and look further into this. And then I started saying a lot of misrepresentations of Pope Francis and others. Not that there aren't legitimate criticisms of Pope Francis, there are, but in many cases, sometimes there's misreports, misinformation, a twisting of the facts. Um, so can you talk to me about considering sources here? How big of a problem do you think this is? And maybe what are some tips that you have?
Well, the funny thing is, I don't think that a discerning reader or viewer should be afraid of any source, but they should understand where their sources' allegiances lie.
Mhm.
Like, what I write is, so where Peter is, people, unfortunately, people throw on modernist, progressive, ultra liberal, you know, Biden support, like whatever, people throwing all kinds of things on top of that. But it's like, if you come to us, and I'm not like I said last time I was on your program, it's like, if there is a defense of Pope Francis that makes sense,
Mhm.
and one of our contributors or myself actually holds to this, that's what you're going to find. So you're going to find what's going on from Cardinal Roche and Pope Francis's perspective on our
Mhm.
site. We don't make any, we don't lie about where we're coming from. This is what we're going to try to do. You've got your perspective, which is like, let's uphold the magisterium. Some of the prudentially, you're very clear, like certain things that are going on in the modern church, while they might be doctrinally licit,
Mhm.
you know, your
Sure.
it's like
Sure.
your excommunication episode the other day. It's like, that's a licit approach, I don't know if I'd probably just excommunicate people to just get them out of my face. You
Yeah,
but
I think we just need to bring back more excommunications. That's
I
that's
mean,
I'm not saying go crazy with them.
no, I understand, but I'm just saying, it's a valid approach, and it could be a concern. And if it's like, if you got your audience with, Pope Francis, and okay, here's a list of 8 guys that I need you to excommunicate. Be my guest. Be my guest. If he, just don't get too upset if he doesn't follow through. If he only excommunicates 5 of them instead of all 8. Um, but it's like, I think that there are a lot of sources, and this is the thing. Like, I was a conservative Catholic. I don't know. I got kicked out of the club, but I still believe in everything the Catholic Church teaches. But it's like, I used to go to EWTN and First Things, and a lot of these different outlets, and think that I was going to find something that was unbiased, something that was in line with the Pope.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, and then suddenly I start, these different organizations start turning on the Pope. Like, I was watching EWTN last night, and it was, Peter Kwasniewski was on there giving his version of the rescript story. And it's like, it's okay to watch that, to see what different people think, to evaluate. Um, Part of critical thinking is having that detachment, that ability to step back and to say, um, you know, maybe I don't want to excommunicate as many people as Michael Lofton does, but I do want to excommunicate a few, or or just, that's kind of a harsh example, but it just sort of like, take everything with a grain of salt, and don't think that people don't have an agenda behind what they're saying. And you should also realize that in a lot of cases, your opinions are being dictated by your desires. And one of the things, as Catholics, and serious committed Catholics, we should orient our desires towards following the church's teaching, towards following Christ, being obedient to the church that Christ founded. Because if we decide that we want to wrap up our, um, our attention, our desire in a certain form of the liturgy, or of, you see, like our parish priest, everything, we love our pastor, tie our entire spiritual lives into our pastor, and then our pastor gets transferred,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden we turn on the new guy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like we can place our desires. Not always a bad thing to obviously like a certain liturgy, or to, love a pastor, but it's like when we become too attached, that's when things start to get dangerous. And so I know that recently you said you were thinking about not mentioning certain names,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a smart idea. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for me, I'm talking more about like actual bishops and authorities and,
Sure.
players. And so it's a little
Sure.
harder. But when you're talking about general concepts,
Mm-hmm.
like I mean, I run into it when I mention a certain bishop, that to me, I've thought for the past, 5 years, he's gone off the rails. Well, someone else might just think this is a holy bishop. This is what I've always thought. This, I believe this person, so I'm immediately going to discount this opinion. And so if you're talking about a YouTuber and, you bring up his name and that's going to make people shut you down, it's probably better to just bring up the topic. But it's funny. Another thing I want to bring up, because you had Father Deacon on for the Pachamama to discuss Pachamama incident. And it's funny because he, a lot of the things he was saying were the things that Pedro Gabriel and I have been saying for 3 years. And he said, I've been talking about this stuff for 2 years. And it's like, and I'm just glad someone's finally listening to me. And it was just really funny, because it's like both Pedro and I are like, finally someone is like listening to this stuff. But there's also the whole, like, why weren't they listening to me? Why are they listening to him? And, we can't be, I mean, it's like we couldn't just be attached to that. We're just happy that the truth is finally getting out, and that people are opening up their ears in a new way, and that people are stepping back. And this is what always needs to happen. We need to step back and see if we are misplacing our trust, if we're misplacing our faith, if our faith is too contingent on these 5 things lining up the right way. It's a Friday night, so I'm kind of getting philosophical and
no, it's helpful. And I got one for you here, a super chat. This, I figured it would come up. I've answered it a million times, but usually in the comment section. Michael A asks, and by the way, thank you for the super chat. There might be less schism if people didn't have the impression that heresy, for example, the German bishops, was permitted at the same time as the TLM suppression. The optics of the Pope's priority is impactful. What are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, it's something that I've written about quite a few times, and I think it has to do with the difference between dissent on the left and dissent on the right. Most of the people that just think about the people, everybody think of a liberal Catholic in your life who doesn't believe in something that the church teaches. If they disagree on contraception or they disagree on abortion, they are going to say the church is wrong. I disagree with the church. I've had it with the church. I'm going to leave the church if I don't get my way. Okay, so they're 1 foot outside the door. On the traditionalist side, however, you have people saying, religious liberty is a heresy. The true Catholic teaching is that error has no rights. The Pope is wrong. I'm the true Catholic. So you've got 2 opposed visions. You've got one on the left, you've got people who have 1 foot out the door. And on the right, you have people insisting that their error is correct and they are fully intent on staying. And so it's, for example, I mentioned the same-sex blessing document that came out from the CDF. And apparently, after that came out, in Germany, you actually register what religion you are, because the Catholic Church gets tax money based on the population of Catholics. Apparently, 700,000 people left the Catholic Church over that document. They went to the government office or online or however you do it, and they unregistered as Catholics. So that's a falling away more than a schism. And so, even though Pope Francis keeps kind of repudiating a little bit, and there are criticisms that are going out, and they're playing this kind of tippy toe game, because I think the fear is that the entire thing is just going to collapse in Germany. I think it may happen no matter what happens,
Sure.
but it's like, okay, we're having this schism, or not this schism, sorry, wrong word. It was a Freudian slip. We're having this synod. Everyone's invited. Okay, Germans, you can come and you can put forward your proposals. Doesn't mean they're going to get approved. I mean, we haven't gotten to that point where Rome has signed off on anything from Germany. So it's sort of a, honey versus vinegar. The traditionalists aren't going, the traditionalists, I think, might have to be kicked out if there is going to be a schism in that way, unless, they might leave if they can't access any legitimate Latin masses. But I think you're dealing with two different problems. You're dealing with secularism on one hand, which is basically causing this huge slide of the church in the West, and then you've got this other branch that's within Catholicism that is insisting on a different ecclesiology, that's insisting on a revision of, it basically wants to delete a council and the past 60 years of magisterium.
Now, what I'll say here is that though you do have some instances where Rome is trying to rein in the German problem. So, but I do think more can be done there. I do think Rome can and should do more there. So I want to acknowledge there has been some efforts, but there does need to be more. I also want to say, on the other hand, with the radical traditionalists, they've been giving a great deal of freedom, a great deal of leeway for a lot longer than the German bishops have. And so I don't know. Although I think some of the disciplinary decisions can be excessive, I don't know. They've also been given a lot of leeway. Now, a huge difference, however, one is more touching on the area of heresy. The other one is touching more on the area of schism. So there is a little bit of a difference there, although eventually that heresy will also lead to schism, right? So they're certainly related. But here's one big difference, though, and it may account for one of the reasons why we're seeing some differences here. I don't know if they justify them, but disciplining an episcopal conference is different than disciplining laity who are fomenting schism. There's a huge difference. And I think the Pope, for better or worse, is being as careful as possible with an entire episcopal conference, because if he makes the wrong move, it could be that an entire national church goes into schism, not just a group of laity and perhaps priests, but here you would have an entire nation of bishops. That doesn't justify any inconsistencies in the discipline between these two groups. That doesn't justify. And it also doesn't mean that more shouldn't be done with the Episcopal Conference of the German bishops and other Flemish bishops. I'm not saying more shouldn't be done, but I wonder if that is what is in the back of Pope Francis's mind with this issue. Possibly.
Well, and I think part of it also is that they do publicly say that ultimately they're going to, on matters of doctrine, of matters that relate especially, like specifically to the universal church, that they will ultimately obey authority. Now, will they do that? I don't know. But I know that what winds up happening is things kind of start getting heated up, and then one or two of their leaders will meet with Pope Francis and meet with Cardinal Ladaria, sit down, and then everybody comes out smiling. So it's sort of like, maybe in this meeting, it sounded like things were going okay. Okay, this is what we need to focus on. Now we understand each other. And then and then the German bishops leave and then go do whatever the heck they want to do. That might be part of the dynamic too. It's a human issue too. It's not, we have this tendency to think of things as like good guys, bad guys, black hats, white hats, but it's sort of like, what are the relationships here? What's the background behind these people? Germany is also sort of undergoing a crisis of credibility because they they've been going through their abuse crisis for, the past 5 years, unlike us who've been going through it for 20, 25 years. So it's, they're different sensitivities. I think in terms of like regular Catholics, Pope Francis might be a little bit more sensitive to people who, fall away or struggle with addictions or attractions or whatever than people who are just sort of like ideologically firm. Um, that might be a difference too. And I'm not saying that there aren't valid. Yeah, I agree with you. There are valid criticisms of how it's handled, but I don't know that you or I could go in there and necessarily do it any better.
I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, Pope Francis has been listening. He's been.
I'd love to give it a shot. So if Pope Francis wants to resign and appoint me Pope somehow,
dicasteries can now be headed by lay people, so that that can always be your
Rome. If you're listening, I'll throw my hat in the ring. I'm up for the job. Here's a question for you from Michael Baumert. Does Mike see a similar danger of schism from the progressive side? We kind of touched on that, but
I mean, I would see it as a falling away more than a schism. I don't know that there's enough energy, honestly. Like, you see progressive churches, they've collapsed faster, Episcopalians and so forth have collapsed faster than the Catholic Church. I think people will just walk away. I mean, I think people who are professional, liberal theologians and professional bishops might continue to try to do something, but I don't see them bringing congregations along with them or anything like that. I don't think it would be a schism of committed, progressive heretics. I don't see that coming. I see it as people just deciding they've had enough with the church and leaving. I mean, in Protestant countries like Finland and Sweden, they're down to 1% church attendance, and I think the Catholic Church in certain places probably isn't very is behind them, but I think it's the same trajectory.
There's another one from you from Thunder Thumbs. Did Benedict envision having only one form of the liturgy in the Roman Rite at the same point? If so, why not just retire the TLM now?
Well, I think he definitely did see them as rejoining. In retrospect, I don't know that mutual enrichment really, I don't know how that was supposed to work. I think in some ways, I think it might have helped teach Novus Ordo priests and congregations about a certain kind of reverence. But I know that in 1984, when they had the first indults, I know JP2 said, no mixing of the rites, no combination. So I don't know how they would have merged. There's no organic mechanism for that to happen, if that makes sense.
I don't know. I mean, maybe if you have a priest who does both forms, and since you have the option of having Latin Gregorian chant ad orientem in the Novus Ordo, maybe a priest who benefits from those in the Missal of 62 can then bring those options into the Novus Ordo. That could be the case. A valid criticism, however, I think could be is that perhaps there shouldn't be options in the Novus Ordo, at least on some of these things. Perhaps they should be mandated, such as ad orientem perhaps should be required. That's my opinion. But
yeah, I mean, I would say, like I said before, I think that it's a good thing that it's available somewhere. That actually, I guess it would be pro option, but I think that a very traditionally styled, only Eucharistic prayer number one, only ad orientem, that when I go to Saint Pius V's on Main Street, that's what I'm getting. And a community could build up around that. I think the thing that I think a lot of online Catholics misunderstand, or maybe don't realize, is that the people in the pews, who are not the people watching this program, who are not the people hosting this program, who are not the people writing for Where Peter Is, they show up on Sunday and the priest turns around. And I know parishes where this has happened, and the people just flip out. And I also know that there's a parish near me that is, they got sort of a tratty pastor, still Novus Ordo, but he did, It's like he got rid of the contemporary choir, replaced them with chant. And then all of a sudden people started coming to my parish, which is just it's not like it's a ultra modernist parish, but it's like the music is just the breaking bread hymnal, and nothing super tratty about it, nothing irreverent, but they're just like, the music is so much better here, as all they play is that that chant. And I'm like thinking the other way around. I'm thinking like, I wish that chant would be over here.
Yeah.
But then it just sort of dawned on me that that's not what the average Catholic, and I mean, these are devout Catholics, a lot of them that I know, it's like they're devout Catholics who take their faith seriously, raise their kids in the faith, take part in, Stations of the Cross and the different devotions, and practice, Humanae Vitae. And I mean, they're devout Catholics, but they just like contemporary music, which, I mean, and I think that's it's, the Beatles are always going to outsell Mozart. Like, it's just a fact of human nature. And, someone who's going to be like, I think Palestrina is great. And other people are like, I prefer Here I Am, Lord. And there are going to be 10 more. There are going to be 10 Here I Am, Lord people for every Palestrina people. I mean, human beings, we just, sometimes we just like to watch America's Funniest Home Videos, instead of what? I don't know. What is it that people, the highbrow movies that people like?
I don't know. I don't get it. I'd go with the Gregorian chant. So I don't get it. I don't get it at all. The drums and all that. It's like, just stop. This doesn't suit the Roman Rite very well.
I know. And I think the thing is, most people experience the faith on the ground. Like, this conversation might not make this entire conversation would make, like, my brother's a priest, for example, and she heard about Traditionis Custodes, a parishioner at his church, and she read an article about it that she didn't really understand, and she got really upset about it, and she went to my brother and said, what are they changing? And he's like, for you, nothing. Like, everything's going to be exactly the same for you, And it's like, sometimes we focus on these issues because we talk about them, but this is just a church lady, she just goes to Mass on Sunday. She likes going to Mass, and as long as the 10 o'clock Mass on Sunday isn't canceled, like, her life is as she knows it, is going to continue.
Here's one for you. Well, before that, Pope Lofton would excommunicate half the church. Dunharrow Farm says. That's funny. Here's a super chat for you. Can Pope Francis have bishops ready to replace the German bishops if they decide to go into schism? That'd be a pretty tough thing to do, to have replace an entire Episcopal conference. I'm not saying it's not necessary in some cases. Maybe it would be, but gosh, that would be pretty hard to do.
Well, I mean, it'd be kind of interesting to see how it took place in the like, when some of the Eastern churches broke, because it's like, I mean, doesn't Alexandria has 3 different patriarchs?
Yeah.
They have and I don't know, like, the local bishops and stuff. I don't know. I mean, it probably would depend on how many Catholics or how many people stick with the church.
Mm-hmm.
He might. I mean, I'm just sort of speculating. Like, if any country went into schism, he might pick an apostolic delegate to oversee the remaining Catholics, and then
just depending on how many people remain is going to determine how many bishops. Here's another one. In 2001, Fogan Bo Ratzinger posed 2 rights. He posed continuity via abbeys and orders, parishes, and those more problematic. Not sure I really understand.
Personal parishes. So I think he proposed it or he posed it, because I know that different, like, the Dominicans and different orders have their own rights, but I would need more clarification on. I mean, I think that one of the things, I think that when it came down to, this was a Paul VI thing, was he hoped that the monasteries would preserve Gregorian chant, like the Benedictines and the Dominicans, because he knew that there was going to be this transition to vernacular after all those dispensations were requested, and then he kind of gave a blanket one. And so it's like, well, how are we going to preserve Gregorian chant? Now, my proposal, I think, might help preserve it even more. I would also mandate it in the cathedral of the diocese. So like at least one parish and one cathedral would have sort of a focus on chant. And
That was John Paul II's thing. He was going to require the Missal of 62 at every cathedral, and he was ready to sign the document, but I forget what the reason was that he didn't sign it. But he ended up going with, Ecclesia Dei Afflicta model. But here's another one. Why do you think that 40% of the church's TLMs are celebrated in America, which comprise only 6% or so of the world's Catholics? I don't know.
I mean, I think it's sort of where the movement started. I think we had there was a priest, Gomer de Paul or something like that. He was a theologian at Mount St. Mary's. He was one of the very first to reject Vatican II. And I know de Laurier, a Dominican who helped write the Annunciation or the Assumption dogma in 1950. He was like the world's first sedevacantist. And I think he may have wound up in New York, but I think whatever it was, I think it was the French and it's like France, U.S., and England are sort of the big places where traditionalism caught hold.
Okay.
This is another part of the narrative that people don't. And it's funny because my dad was a convert to the faith in 1970, so he was in 1973, so he wasn't around during Vatican II. My mom grew up in the pre-Vatican II church, and her father very much opposed the reforms. And so I kind of grew up thinking, okay, there were people who didn't like the reforms and there were people who did, but I think the reality was like 99% of the church was like, oh wow, we can understand what's going on now. And a lot of them weren't following along in the missal, so they didn't notice that the collects had been changed, or they didn't notice that, it's like it's sort of a difference between the people in the pews and the people in that are talking about these things. But I think in the U.S., we're a very political people. And so we tend to see things in terms of this side and that side. And I'm guilty of it. It's like, oh, this guy likes that guy. So I don't, and I think it just developed in the U.S. And I think the U.S. is also a very independent streak, kind of, when it comes to religion. You think of people who plant, it's in our nature, like people who plant churches. It's something that Americans do. And so traditionalism is kind of an offshoot of that independent spirit. Like, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to follow, I'm going to follow God in this particular way. It's sort of the Catholic version of, I did watch your show earlier. So sort of the fundamentalism, it's a form of fundamentalism. And I think fundamentalism is in our blood. It's one of those things where they say, like, the U.S. is, 90% of U.S. Catholics are Calvinists in a way. I think we're a Calvinist country with a Calvinist work ethic, and then you graft Catholic theology onto it, and somehow you wind up with assumptions that aren't always there. I don't know if you were a Calvinist, right? So I don't know if you could see those parallels.
I could certainly see some of that. Absolutely. Yeah.
Whereas I think, it's funny because it's like this, the Italians, it's sort of like, it's in their blood to be Catholic. It's sort of the default. So it's sort of like, how deeply am I going to dive into this thing that's the default of my culture? I read this article written by, I think he was an Irish priest who went, he's talking, and the Irish historically were very strict in following rules and the Eucharistic fast. And he tells a story about how he, when he went to Rome and he was going to celebrate a mass, he goes into the sacristy and all these Italian priests are in there eating cereal, like right before mass. And he looks at them and he's like, what about the Eucharistic fast? And like one of the Italian priests picks up the bowl and puts the spoon up and lets it go. And he says, see, it doesn't stick. It's not food. And it's like, I mean, I probably scandalized you, but it's sort of this whole, it's like, once, like I accidentally at work, I like popped like someone had a pretzels, a little basket of pretzels. I popped one into my mouth and at, 11:15 in the morning. And I went to noon mass and I received communion. And I had scruples all day, the rest of the day. And I don't know, like, did I make it? Did I not? I wasn't looking at my clock. And I went and confessed it. And the priest in there was like, "Oh, you fasted for 55 minutes."
Well, if you don't know, technically you didn't have to confess it, but
Well,
yeah.
but I mean, it was like I think I
Sure.
was pretty sure it was less than an hour. But
Sure,
I mean,
sure,
that's the
sure.
kind of thing. But like, it's one of those things. Like, should I have been that scrupulous? I followed the
Yeah.
rule, or I didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like two totally different approaches to the faith, and it's like
Sure.
it's hard to like. I think that there's a balance in there somewhere, but it's like
Sure.
I don't know what I think the priests in the sacristy were probably too lax, and I think that Mike going to confession the same day because he popped a donut hole at 11:25 or whatever it was, that might have been a little bit overboard.
I get it. I struggled, years back with scrupulosity, so I totally get it. So yeah, been there. I have a whole lot of stories to tell, so I know what that's like. But thank you so much for coming on and doing this. This was really, really insightful. I'm glad that you also stuck around and answered some super chats for me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it was a good time. Just Friday night talking about
about rescripts,
random church stuff, rescripts, liturgical theory.
I enjoy it. I enjoyed it.
I mean, this is what I thought. So it's like people this is just us hanging out.
Yeah.
And
I think they're fun conversations. I'd rather do this on a Friday night than watch a football game or something like that.
I used to be the biggest sports fan. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know if it was COVID or
I don't know. I'm such not a sports watcher that I didn't even know that they had the Super Bowl the other day, but evidently on the day of the Super Bowl, somebody asked me what team am I going for. I was like, what are you talking about for the Super Bowl? I was like, I didn't even know it was football season, let alone that there was a Super Bowl taking place today. But yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at.
I used to be hardcore into it, and just I was a huge baseball fan, and I had fallen out of it. And I've got two boys that are 14 and 16, and so I'm from DC. The Nationals were in the World Series, and I'm like, I've been such a failure as a dad that my kids my boys that are this age. So like they actually got into it. We watched the World Series in 2019, and I don't think I've watched a full game since, but at least we did that. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, again, I appreciate you coming on and doing this. Truly enjoy the conversation. Love to have you back on again in the future.
Absolutely. When something crazy happens,
hey, and put in a plug for anything you want to make the viewers aware of.
Yeah, I mean, just go visit wherepeteris.com. We try to post a new article every day. Right now, we've got a pretty academic series going on, but we've got Lenten reflections. We've got we try to give some commentary on the news. Keep in mind we're coming from a certain perspective, but if you want to know what the perspective is coming from Pope Francis, that's what we're trying to present. So
yeah, awesome. Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed it. Everybody hit the like button and the subscribe button. Help this channel grow. By the way, check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support me. And just so that y'all are aware, we created an RNT channel in Spanish. It is a separate channel where basically RNT videos are now being dubbed over in audio with Spanish. So if you know somebody who would benefit from it, please share it with them. The name of the channel is, again, I'll butcher the pronunciation, I'm sure, but Razón y Teología. I will, in fact, share the screen real quick just so that you can see it and get a visual idea of it. You should be able to see it now, but here it is, Razón y Teología. So yeah, go and check that out and share it with anybody that you know who would benefit from it. All right, once again, that's going to do it. We will see y'all later. Y'all have a good evening.
God bless.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you.
Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause,